Hey there, everyone. My name is Patrick Kelly. I'm the Director of Education at Stokes Nature Center, and welcome to another Canyon Conversation that we'll be holding every other week. I'm joined today by Dr. Zach Miller, who works at the Quinney College of Natural Resources, and one of his many specialties is a topic called the human-wildlife interface, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Hi there, Zach. How are you?
Hi, Patrick. I'm doing well. Coming from you in my living room here, so excuse the video quality or any kind of noise going on.
No worries at all. So for those that don't really know you yet before this talk, can you talk a little bit about what you do up at the university and anything else you study besides the human-wildlife interface?
Sure. So as Patrick said, my name is Zach Miller. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Environment and Society in the Quinney College of Natural Resources at Utah State University here in Logan, Utah. And I generally consider myself a conservation social scientist. So I look at how humans relate to and are impacted by different environmental aspects. Areas that I really focus on are park and protected area management, particularly related to high levels of visitor use, human-wildlife relationships, and strategic communication as well. And in all of my research, what I'm most excited about is working with managers to help implement science-based frameworks for learning and understanding all these different human-nature relationships.
That's awesome. That sounds like a very relevant piece of work, especially for us here in Utah.
Absolutely. There's a lot of public lands, a lot of great wildlife, and a lot of recreation users as well. So Utah's a great place to be a professor and as a person who loves wildlife and protected areas and public lands.
Awesome. Well, before we jump into this, thank you for your service, helping to manage us so that there is a nature for generations and we can all have those amazing, significant experiences we all get out there in wild places.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks to Stokes as well for helping get people outdoors and help us learn about the environments that we play and recreate in.
Yeah, of course. Well, let's just jump right in it. So today we're going to be talking about the human-wildlife interface, which is a series of 10-cent words. For those of us that don't really understand what that is, what is the human-wildlife interface? What is it?
Yeah, so I really think about it as human-wildlife interactions, which is a really broad spectrum that captures a bunch of different things, ranging from conflicts, like how campers might create conflict with black bears by not storing food properly, or conflict in that, urban coyote issues might be a type of wildlife conflict. But I also think it ranges to interactions, which are a much more positive and beneficial thing. This could be the amount of health and well-being benefits that time spent in nature, particularly listening to things like birdsong, how those things contribute to human well-being. Or it might be something more like, being able to experience things like solitude or transcendence by viewing wildlife in a lot of the different areas that we have around Utah. So human-wildlife interactions range from the positive to the negative, from very distant interactions to very close interactions. But I think the key here is really about trying to understand the reciprocity between both people and wildlife as not necessarily this unidirectional process, but as this relationship where things go back and forth between people and wildlife. And that's really what I mean when I say human-wildlife interactions.
That's fascinating. It sounds like this realm of study, it sounds pretty new, pretty recent, just because of the multi-directionality. It's not necessarily 1950s positivism. So what's a little bit of the history? How did this field, or how did the idea of the human-wildlife interface briefly come about?
Sure. Well, people and wildlife have always been very tied together. Whether it's the spiritual or traditional relationships that a lot of indigenous people have with wildlife, or some of the more utilitarian relationships that people have developed with wildlife for procuring food or warmth or all sorts of different stuff. And so these relationships are really old. It's nothing new. I think all this kind of spawned from where most other things spawned in the conservation area, with an understanding that people play a role in these natural processes, and we have to understand those things a little better. I think that this field really spawned in the 1960s after this thing called the ORC report, which I think is the Outdoor Recreation Research Commission or something like that, where for the first time social science was really allowed into the natural resources field. We were asking questions about people and how they relate to their environment to help us plan for the future and provide great opportunities for people to experience nature as well. Ever since then, we've really started to incorporate more of these human aspects into the natural resources frameworks. And now it's a pretty mainstream thing, trying to understand human perspectives of the environment. For me, as a personal genesis of why I started studying this, at some point in my career, I realized that conservation really means human behavior. And that's what I wanted to understand, was how people behave and relate to the natural world. And so the early genesis, probably back in that Aldo Leopold / 1960s era. But for me, it was more of an experiential process along the way.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a really fascinating history. And that timeline kind of syncs up a lot with our other fields within conservation ecology that became more broad and I hope it's not a bad word, but qualitative, where we can have these understandings based upon experience and not just based upon counts of things. That's really cool. My next question is, so you talked a little bit about it, about the history and sort of how it came up, but why is the human-wildlife interface important to understand? What is the benefit to scientists and also to us everyday recreators or explorers or birders getting out there?
Sure, that's a really good question. I think I'll address that in two ways, and I kind of touched on this already, but part of it is trying to understand, how do we better conserve some of our wildlife resources, and more broadly, a lot of our natural resources. And so a lot of, as I said earlier, a lot of conservation, at least to me, when we say that word, we're really talking about how humans behave. And in order to understand that, we need to understand the social science aspects of conservation and natural resource management more broadly. So if you're trying to manage any kind of natural context where people are part of it, which is more or less all context nowadays, incorporating those social science aspects is really important. So that could help alleviate things like, as I brought up earlier, food storage in the backcountry related to bears. Bears get into food. Not only is it a bad experience for the people who are camping, but that bear is probably going to get in trouble and possibly have to be euthanized or destroyed, taken out of the population. So if we want to understand how to improve the situation by helping people have a good time and helping bears stay out of trouble, we really need to understand those human behavior aspects of food storage. So that's one thing I would say is social science can really help alleviate some of those troubling or negative aspects of natural resource management. The other side of it is all of us, probably here in Logan and statewide as well, we're talking right now through the COVID pandemic crisis, and I'm part of the Institute of Outdoor Recreation and Tourism here at Utah State University, and they recently just released a report that recreation amongst Utah residents is up 111% from last year. So people are really starting to go out and enjoy their natural surroundings, and a huge part of that's wildlife. I mean, you can't walk around a canyon or a trail right now without hearing some robins or evening grosbeaks or whoever else is out chirping around. I seem like Western tanagers just seem to be ripping off the trees too in a lot of these places. So, wildlife contributes to the well-being and the quality of people's lives. And by understanding the beneficial aspects of wildlife as well, I think not only can people improve their own well-being, but we can also contribute to the well-being of wildlife by continuing to have people experience wildlife, and hopefully that'll make them better stewards of wildlife as well.
Yeah, that's great. That's fascinating. How do you go about measuring some of these metrics that you're talking about? What is well-being? What is an improved quality of life?
Yeah,
You use like a 1 through 10 Likert scale and ask, how well-being are you? Or how is your
that's
quality of life? How do you,
yeah,
what is a little bit of sausage making? You don't have to go into the statistics, but maybe a little,
sure.
when you're on the ground conducting research, what does that look like?
So I think my answer to you is not going to be satisfactory. It's gonna be, it depends, right? And so I think it really does depend on the types of research questions that we're trying to tackle. So I've done a lot of research with distance-related conflict in national parks related to wildlife, and how we measure those things can depend on the setting and the questions that particularly managers have. So, we might use what we would call visual-based methods, where we show people a series of different pictures and ask them to rate those pictures on a type of scale. Sometimes we use self-reported measures that are broadly referred to as PANAS, which is positive and negative affect, to help understand that. And more broadly, when we're studying outdoor recreation, we try to look at this thing called normative conditions, where when you put people into a setting in any kind of recreation context, there's going to be some kind of negative impact, right? You can't put people in a place and there'd be no impact. There's going to be some impact. So the question is never if impact is going to occur, it's how much impact is acceptable. And we try to figure out that acceptable impact based on the on-the-ground conditions, and the discrepancy between those two things can also be considered a type of well-being or satisfaction, if you will, that people are having good quality experiences while they're out there. We're all familiar of going up to a place like Wind Cave and you can't find a parking spot. There's 200 people out there, that level of density might decrease the quality of your experience, but certainly you don't expect there to be no one there all the time. So what is that acceptable amount of people? We try to figure out that question and match that on the ground conditions, particularly with things like wildlife and other recreation settings as well. So to answer your question, I think it really depends on the research questions and the specific context of what we're studying.
Doesn't some of that also depend on the personal preference of whoever you're surveying? I'm thinking about the wind caves. For one user, their threshold for enjoyment maybe they only see 10 people on the trail. Another user, their threshold of enjoyment is, maybe they're coming from a large urban area and they're like, 100 people's fine. This is
Yeah.
So how do you use statistical analysis to control for those shifting medians, or are you working more with a set of parameters in which we find that between this and this, most people are able to experience the trail in such a way that they find it acceptable and it contributes to their well-being rather than detracting from their well-being?
Yeah. So I think you bring up a great point. I think for the most part, that it's the latter, where we actually call these things social norms, where they're a collective of people's personal norms, right? So we can aggregate those and say, okay, for most people, here's what things look like. But I think more and more we're realizing, for a variety of complex reasons that are probably beyond the scope of this conversation, that we need to be a little more refined in that approach. So an example of this is I've done some research on the impact of natural gas compressor sounds from fracking and how they impact recreation users. And what we find is that particularly the noise, the sound from those natural gas compressors, how they're impacting people. Sound's one of these things that's pervasive across a lot of natural resource settings and recreation settings that's important to people's experience. So for motorized users, you would probably assume that the noise from fracking is not really that big of a deal. They don't really care much about it, and that makes sense. But for people who are not motorized users, whether they're kayakers or hikers or walking their dog, the noise from those gas well pads has quite a bit of impact on their experience. And so as a scientist, it's not my position to tell managers what to do in that context. They have to establish the management objective of who they're managing for and what experiences they want to provide, and then use the information I provide them as an informed decision-making component. And there are a lot of nuances to this. Another thing is looking at people's motivations, right? So obviously, if you were more focused on having some kind of solitude experience, you probably want to go to Wind Cave, but your threshold for the number of people there would be lower as well.
Yeah.
We find this with some wildlife-related research as well. So in fact, just this last month, a graduate student from Penn State, as well as one of my colleagues from Penn State, and I published a article looking at how the use of smartphones can impact people's perceptions of safe distances around wildlife, right?
Oh,
so it's one of the, as far as I know, it's the only study that's looked at these viewing devices and how they impact these perceptions of distance. And smartphone use had a little bit of an impact, but really not that much. So we can also start to segment people out in that way to better understand what's influencing what these acceptable conditions are.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Thank you for sharing a little bit of the sausage making.
Yeah. Probably too much. Don't ever ask a scientist what they those complicated questions. They'll get a mouthful.
All right, I'll skip it with the next guy. But my next question, kind of winding back around to the human-wildlife interface, is what is one or two things that we now understand better because of our use and understanding of the human-wildlife interface? So what are some management decisions we've seen implemented because of research within this topic of the field?
So I think one thing that we've learned is that communication with people can be an effective tool for managing these things when it's done right. One of the things that I think I've learned, and collectively our fields learned from a lot of these studies, is that people's knowledge about things don't predict their behavior that well. And instead, it's based on their beliefs and their relationships and their idea about what they are and are not able to do, or social pressures. Those are a lot of the things that contribute to their behavior. And so if we really want to try to address human behavior, we have to focus on those kind of things. And I think it's really hard for a lot of other scientists to understand that, particularly biophysical or natural scientists, because, I think there's just such an assumption that knowledge equates to behavior. One of my favorite examples when people are like, that's not true, is, if you're driving down the road and the speed limit's 45 miles an hour and everyone's driving 55 and you're cruising along, and all of a sudden brake lights start going off and everyone slows down to 45 miles an hour, right? And everyone starts going the speed limit. What just happened, Patrick? Can you guess?
Speed trap.
Speed trap. There's probably a cop nearby, right? No one magically learned that the speed limit's 45 miles an hour. They knew that. There just needed a reason to care. So we have to understand what people care about if we want to communicate effectively with them about wildlife issues or a lot of other natural resource issues too. So that's one thing. I think another thing we've learned is that we need wildlife as people. Wildlife really does contribute to the quality of life of individuals. Even going outside and taking a walk in the park can reduce stress levels, relieve anxiety, all sorts of stuff that contributes to the human health and well-being of people. And these aren't just self-reported measures. A lot of these are looking at stress hormone responses, cortisol levels, and all sorts of stuff. we're getting more and more sophisticated with our methods and our ability to test this, but bird song is one of those things that just seems to be universal. People like to hear birds, and those birds contribute to the quality and well-being of the people who are able to listen to them. And so more and more we're seeing wildlife is really important to us as well.
That's great. It's nice when science can reinforce some of those things that maybe we have in our gut. Because, I love birdsong as much as the next guy. It's nice that, it's doing something to my cortisol levels and
Yeah.
me a little bit more at peace as I telecommute. Yeah.
Well, it's funny you say that, because one of the studies that I was part of in Muir Woods National Monument, which is over in California, people had higher levels of well-being even if they did not detect an increase in species, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that kind of reminds me of a little bit of that the forest bathing aesthetic that they have over there. Yeah, awesome. My last question for you, I'm kind of excited about it. Are there any existential questions that you grapple with in terms of the human-wildlife interface as a concept, perhaps as a construct or a yardstick? What, if you're on a human-wildlife interface kick, what keeps you up at night staring at the ceiling?
What keeps me up at night? I think one thing is I think the thing that keeps me up at night, this is going to be a little different than the other things that I've talked about, is how our funding mechanisms work in order to fund wildlife conservation in the United States. So I hunt, I fish, I'm a big bird watcher. Most recently, when I was a kid, I was really into catching lizards and snakes. So most recently, being back in Utah, I've got back into herping, looking for lizards and snakes. But the more urban that the US becomes, it just so happens that hunting and angling tend to decrease with that as well. And we can explain that through a variety of mechanisms. But when hunting and angling decreases, it reduces the amount of money that's available for state agencies to manage wildlife. And that's a really big challenge. So every time someone buys a firearm, whether it's for hunting or not, anytime anyone buys ammunition or a hunting license or a duck stamp or anything of fishing equipment, there are excise taxes on that equipment that contribute to public funding. These have been in place since at least the 1940s or earlier. If you're interested, look up the Pittman-Robertson and the Johnson-Dingell Acts. Those are the ones that kind of initiated these funds. And as hunting and angling decreases in the United States, it's going to be a real challenge for a lot of these state agencies. And so I would challenge the non-hunter and angler crew of wildlife users, whether you're a bird watcher or even just enjoy looking at wildlife while you're hiking, to find a way to contribute to the public conservation of wildlife, because so much of the conservation is actually paid for by hunters and anglers, and yet they're decreasing all the time. So we need to find a way to be able to continue to fund wildlife conservation through either recruiting and retaining more hunters and anglers, or by finding different funding mechanisms so that these non-consumptive wildlife users can contribute to the conservation of public resources like wildlife as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. When those that are using the landscape and the resources in a particular way, hunters and anglers, myself included, when, as folks stop to hunt and fish for a variety of reasons, be they ethical or lack of education, yeah, we're not having less human-wildlife interactions as urbanization grows, especially we see that in Utah along the Wasatch. In fact, we're having more interaction but less funding. It sounds like a dangerous parabola.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to recognize that the people who are mountain biking or hiking or trail running, there are real impacts to wildlife from those activities as well. It might not be the take of species, like some hunters and anglers. But nonetheless, there can be some pretty serious ramifications for wildlife from those things as well. So everyone's having an impact. The question is, how do we continue to create good management for wildlife into the future?
Yeah. Well, that's a great existential question for us to kind of wrap up on. Maybe we'll start to pick that apart in a different canyon conversation. But Zach, thank you so much again for joining me from your home during this time. And I hope all is well with you, and good luck with your research in the future. And let us know if you ever need to deploy surveys.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Patrick.
All right. Thank you, Zach.